7 continents, 1 world. Bringing you the latest in international news from the WRHU studio in Hempstead, New York on 88.7 FM and WRHU.org. This is Around the World in 30 minutes with Eli Finkelson.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Around the World in 30 Minutes. I'm your host, Eli Finkelson, to keep you updated on the world around you. Our top story today, an Iraqi court struck back at President Trump's persistent aggression late last week. This came as a judge opened an investigation into the killings of Qasem Soleimani and Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis back in January. Trump faces charges of premeditated murder, which is punishable by death in Iraq. After the drone strike on January 3rd, 2020, President Trump bragged about the killings, calling them, quote, 2 for the price of 1. The United Nations Special Rapporteur for Extrajudicial, Summary, or Arbitrary Executions called the drone strike, quote, arbitrary and illegal. This is not the first time Iraq has issued a warrant for Trump's arrest, the first of which happened in June 2020, when Interpol intervened and said it had no intention of complying with Iraq's request. Luckily for the president, he cannot be arrested unless he steps foot on Iraqi soil, which is unlikely. However, the warrant is symbolic, coming in the final days of the Trump administration and highlighting tensions between Trump and a country that is supposed to be an ally in the Middle East. And a global nuclear watchdog report has confirmed that Iran has continued to enrich their uranium supply, now up to 20% purity. This is the highest percentage of purity Iran has ever reached and is the country's biggest breaking of the Iran nuclear deal made with world powers in 2015, specifically causing tensions between Iran and the United States. Tensions were high after the killing of Iranian General Soleimani almost exactly 1 year ago, and global tensions with Iran were heightened this past November with the assassination of an Iranian scientist known as the father of Iran's nuclear project. In order to make nuclear weapons, uranium purity must be at 90%. The watchdog site says all operations are happening through the underground Fordo plant. In England, Julian Assange will not be extradited just yet to the United States after a judge determined the WikiLeaks founder may harm himself. Assange has been in prison since 2019 after hiding out in an Ecuadorian embassy to avoid extradition and charges in the United States. District Judge Vanessa Beretzer ruled on Monday, January 4th, that Assange may either try to flee or kill himself if he's moved. The United States has appealed the decision and asked that he remain in a maximum security prison until trial. Top officials of the Tigray People's Liberation Front have been killed by Ethiopian troops, according to an announcement made Thursday, January 7th, by state military. At least 4 major supporters and inside authorities of the TPLF have been killed, with 9 others reportedly arrested. No one outside of the Ethiopian military has confirmed the killings as of Friday, January 8th. Similar to the events that took place on Capitol Hill on January 6th, Ghana also experienced some adversity trying to swear in a new president. Nana Akufo-Addo was elected for a second term in what is known as Africa's most stable democracy. The controversy began when members of parliament attempted to vote for a new speaker. There, a person from the opposing party grabbed a ballot and attempted to run out of the building with it. This developed into small fights between party members, which were eventually resolved by military members. Once everything was settled, Akufo-Addo was sworn in. As China continues to gradually make Hong Kong less autonomous, the citizens are beginning to realize the gravity of the situation. China imposed a new security law on Hong Kong in the middle of last year, which was the first step in taking away their freedom. This week, Chinese authorities launched the largest strike on freedom yet. They've arrested 53 pro-democracy activists, corroborating the fears many had and activists feel is only a matter of time before they lose their independence. Also focusing on Chinese commerce, President Trump has added 8 Chinese banking apps to the list of banned products in the U.S. Trump in the recent months has taken a stance against Chinese applications due to the fears they are stealing information on the American public. Most notably was his effort to ban the popular social media company TikTok. The 8 banks he banned gained popularity in the states, but fears that they are mining information on federal employees. The executive order, however, only takes effect in 45 days when he is out of office. Venezuela voted in a new assembly, but it is anything but balanced. President Nicolas Maduro led the votes in December under the United Socialist Party, also known as the PSUV. Out of 277 seats, the PSUV won an overwhelming 256 seats. The opposing party, led by Juan Guaido, boycotted the polls and called them unjust. All former members of the old assembly have elected to stay and legislate in the old assembly, creating a very confusing political landscape in the nation. And the main suspect believed to be behind the 2002 Bali bombing in Indonesia has been freed from prison. 82-year-old Abu Bakar Bashir was the commander of Jemaah Islamiyah, a militant radical Islamist group behind the Bali bombing. Bashir's release has drawn mixed reactions in both Indonesia, where the bombing took place, and Australia, where the majority of the attack's victims were from. The Bali bombing targeted the Kuta tourist district and resulted in the deaths of over 200 people. The attack led to a U.S.-supported crackdown on radical Islamist groups within the country. Although some have expressed concerns that Bashir's release will lead to increased terrorist activity, Indonesian authorities do not believe he will incite any more attacks. 4 people are dead in Sucre, Bolivia after flash floods wreaked havoc on the city. Several people are still in the hospital being treated for hypothermia. A heavy hailstorm on January 5th is to blame, and although the hail only lasted about an hour, witnesses say the hail caused significant damage and turned city streets into rivers. Areas hardest hit include the city's largest farmers market, where drains were blocked by debris and prevented proper drainage. A Mexican fisherman was killed after his boat collided with a larger vessel operated by an American conservationist group. The collision occurred in the Gulf of California, which is often home to illegal fishing operations. According to the activist group known as Sea Shepherd, their vessel was attempting to leave the area when they were attacked by a group of fishermen in smaller boats. The activists allegedly attempted to evade the fishermen, but a fishing boat was caught beneath the larger vessel and crushed. One other person was on board the fishing boat during the collision, surviving with minor injuries. Sea Shepherd, publicly known from the reality television series Whale Wars, often works with the Mexican government to remove illegal fishing nets from the Gulf. Spain recorded the lowest temperature in its history on January 7th, reaching temperatures of 35.8 degrees Celsius or negative 32 degrees Fahrenheit. The temperature was recorded at the Vega de Lourdes weather station located in the northwestern province of Leon. The previous record low, negative 34.1 degrees Celsius or negative 29 degrees Fahrenheit, was set just one day earlier in the Pyrenees Mountains. Spain is currently being affected by winter storm Filomena, with heavy snowfall expected across much of the Iberian Peninsula. The new record is still 20 degrees Celsius above the lowest recorded temperature in continental Europe, which occurred in Russia in 1978. And in lighter news, a rare white Bengal tiger was born in a Nicaraguan zoo last week. The female cub has been named Nieves, a word meaning snow in Spanish. According to zoo director Eduardo Sacasa, Nieves is the first white tiger to be born in the Central American nation. However, 2 other white tiger cubs were imported to the country in 2019. It is believed Nieves is white due to a recessive gene on her mother's side. While white fur is sometimes associated with health issues, Nieves seems happy and healthy. And now for our continuing coverage of the COVID-19 pandemic. For the latest coronavirus stories and numbers from around the world, let's go to WRHU reporter Connor Donnelly. Connor?
Thank you, Eli. Good evening, everyone. I'm Connor Donnelly with your COVID-19 World Outlook. In England, London Mayor Sadiq Khan declared a sharp increase of cases a major incident, with the number of patients in London hospitals growing by over 25% in the span of 1 week. By declaring a major incident, Khan seeks special action and cooperation from the city's various emergency responder agencies. This is the first time it has been invoked for medical emergencies. Previously, it was only used for terrorist attacks and the Grenfell Tower fire. In Spain, heavy snowfall caused by Storm Filomena is slowing a vaccine distribution. The region rarely experiences this much snow at once, and municipal authorities are struggling to clear it quickly. The Spanish government has deployed hundreds of soldiers to clear the roads and plans to have police escorts for vehicles carrying the vaccine. In Mexico, a video of a dance party with over 1,000 attendees is drawing anger online. Mexico currently has the 4th highest number of COVID fatalities in the world, with over 127,000. While the number of reported cases would appear low, Mexico only recently began widespread testing. Meanwhile, in Brazil, the administration of President Jair Bolsonaro has agreed to buy up to 100 million doses of vaccine being developed by the Chinese company Sinovac. Bolsonaro previously spoke out against the vaccine after his political opponent, João Doria, endorsed its use. Brazil has been the hardest hit country in Latin America with over 8 million cases and over 200,000 deaths. Meanwhile, in China, 11 million people in the city of Shijiazhuang are under lockdown after 39 cases were detected. Mayor Ma Yuzhun says the first round of mass testing took 3 days and uncovered over 300 cases. Meanwhile, the Chinese government is allowing the World Health Organization to send experts to investigate the origins of the virus within the city of Wuhan. In Japan, researchers have identified a new variant of COVID found in travelers arriving from Brazil. Japan's National Institute of Infectious Diseases says it's too early to determine if the variant is resistant to vaccines or possibly more infectious. In the Middle East, Iran's Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei says he is banning the purchase of the Pfizer, AstraZeneca, and Moderna vaccines. He accused the European countries of being untrustworthy and also called into question the safety of the vaccines. Iran is now looking to secure doses of Russian and Indian-made alternatives. The country has experienced over 1.2 million cases and 55,000 deaths. In Israel, over 20% of the population has already received the first dose of the vaccine, with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu saying they plan to vaccinate the entire country by the end of March. Experts say the country's relatively small population and dense population distribution have aided in the vaccine rollout. And in Africa, the African Centers for Disease Control says the continent has passed 3 million confirmed cases and 72,000 deaths. Over one-third of the total cases have been found in South Africa, where the country is struggling with a surge of cases as well as a new variant of COVID. South African President Cyril Ramaphosa is considering new lockdown restrictions as the country awaits their first delivery of vaccines later this month. For Around the World in 30 Minutes, I'm Connor Donnelly. And for a weekend news update, we go to Daniel Gall with a special report.
Tragedies plagued the Java Sea after a deadly plane crash on Saturday, January 9th. A Boeing 737-500 flying for Sriwijaya Air departed from Jakarta, Indonesia. Tracking devices on the aircraft registered the plane to have reached an altitude of 10,900 feet. Shortly after, the plane went into a steep plummet and lost contact 21 seconds later. There were over 60 casualties consisting of 12 crew along with 50 passengers. Authorities are still unsure of the cause of the crash, but the black box has reportedly been found. This has been an Around the World in 30 Minutes news update. I'm Daniel Gall.
Thank you, Connor, for that report. For those of you just joining us, you're tuned into Around the World in 30 Minutes. I'm your host, Eli Finkelson. Now let's move to our featured topic of the week, a topic with significant media coverage, but nonetheless highly important. This week, we're talking about Brexit, Britain's anticipated and highly debated leaving of the European Union. To get background information and insight as to how Brexit will affect citizens and global relations, I spoke with Ngaire Woods, founding dean of the Blavatnik School of Government and professor of global economic governance at the University of Oxford. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Around the World in 30 Minutes. I'm your host, Eli Finkelson, here on 88.7 FM and WRHU.org around the world. Today, we're talking about a topic that has had no shortage of coverage, but some people may not know a lot about it. And we're joined today by Ngaire Woods, founding dean of the Blavatnik School of Government and professor of global economic governance at the University of Oxford. Ngaire, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's lovely to be here, Eli, and good on you for hosting this program.
So first of all, I just want to start with some brief background. Can you explain what Brexit is for those that may not know?
So Brexit has been a hard-fought campaign in Britain about Britain's membership of the European Union. It's pretty much a problem that every country in the world faces. Do you want to be sovereign and make all your own rules? Or do you want to be part of an economic community, whether it's NAFTA or the Continental Free Trade Agreement in Africa, where you make rules collaboratively with other partners in the world? The reason why you would want to belong to the European Union is partly for identity and the idea that if Europeans hold together, they'll be less likely to go to war with one another, and partly because in a world of huge global cooperation, you want huge global competition, you want to stay with your friends and have strength in numbers. And the European Union offers Britain and other countries that are part of the European Union a huge market size to bargain with when they want to do trade deals with the United States or China or any other country in the world. Now, The cost of that is that you obviously have to give up a little sovereignty. You have to pool sovereignty. You have to accept that if standards of food safety are going to be the same for every European country, then they can't each make their own food standards rules. You have to accept that you're all going to have to put some funding into a common budget, force the rules fairly so that all countries play by the same rules. These are issues that every country in the world faces. Now, for Britain, it's been a political hot potato ever since Britain joined the European Union. There have been forces in Britain that have said, no, we want to be a nation that stands on our own, that is not part of the European Union. We want our sovereignty. We don't want to be bound by European rules. And then the other argument, which is that all of that only makes sense theoretically, because in practice, everything we make in Britain, half of what we make is exported into the other countries in the European Union, and almost everything we make relies on close relations with the European Union. So our choice is a rather more stark one, where we can make our own rules, but then we'll be all alone, or we can make rules jointly with our fellow Europeans, and then we'll sacrifice a little sovereignty, but gain in prosperity and better information. That's been the big debate. The Brexiteers, as they're called, are the politicians who decided that they would present to the British population a proposal to come out of the European Union. My own view is that there is a perfectly legitimate case for Brits together saying we don't want to be part of the European Union. But that's not the case that's been made to the Brits. A case was made instead that this would solve all of Britain's problems. Britain's deepest problems have nothing to do with the European Union. It didn't cause those problems, and leaving the European Union will not solve Britain's problems. Britain needs to solve its own problems, and the European Union and Britain's membership of it is a separate issue.
So you outlined so many different, reasons why people may be for it or against it, but why specifically did it take so long for a deal to be reached? We just, Britain just reached a deal with the EU that should be going into effect shortly. Why did it take so long for a deal to be reached? It was pushed off so many times. Why?
So this is, so the Brexiteers, when they went into the referendum in Britain, where Brits got to vote whether they wanted to stay in the European Union or get out of it. The Brexiteers, those who were arguing for Britain to leave the European Union, had no plan on how that was going to happen. They had no strategic plan which said, and this is how we will do it. They simply wanted to ask the British population, do you want to do it or not? Once the British population said, we want to get out of the European Union, the Brexiteers still didn't come up with a plan. They actually then came up with a deadline instead of a plan. And what that's meant is 4 excruciating years of negotiation, where without a clear plan, and what a clear plan would have told you is you need about 10 years to do this in a way that doesn't destroy prosperity in Britain or prosperity in our European Union partner countries. You actually need a lot of time, because these are long-standing arrangements. Just imagine yourself, Eli, if you had a factory that was making, or a farm or a car factory or an insurance company that was doing close business across the European Union, and you were suddenly told, actually, all those rules are going to change because we want our sovereignty back. You would want a long period of time to start adapting your business, adapting to the new rules, and understanding what those new rules were. That hasn't happened. And that has meant that over the last 4 years, there has been this tortuous, very tense negotiation with the European Union, with Britain not really wanting to change the way it does things, but wanting to prove to the population that it's now no longer bound by the European rules, but wanting to keep all the privileges of membership. This is wanting to keep playing golf in your favorite golf club without being a member and without paying your dues. The European Union, on the other hand, has said, no, if you're not going to be a member and pay your dues, we don't want you to play golf on our golf club. You're a member like the rest of us, or you're not. So it's been a fractious negotiation, and it's not been helped by the fact that Britain has undergone several changes of government and changes of negotiators on the way through. That's been extremely difficult. It's very difficult for the European Union, because they're trying to negotiate on behalf of all the countries that form the European Union. They have held together and had a clear position all the way through, and they've been tough. Britain has had a series of changing positions. Mrs. May did a deal and her own party didn't back it. So that made life easy neither for Brits and British business and British organizations nor for the Europeans. So that's why it's taken so long. It's also very difficult. Trade deals affect everybody. You might think that the small business producing coffee mugs down the road from me is unaffected by this. Of course it's not. It's affected by it. It's affected by all the fine detail of a trade agreement. And that's why trade agreements take a long time, because they affect everybody. And if you're going to do them fairly, you need to know how they're going to affect everybody. So we're only really just starting a process. Britain is going to be negotiating with the European Union for at least the next decade. If you think about Switzerland, which didn't want to be a European Union member, it took them 14 years to negotiate 122 different agreements so that they can interact with the European Union in a seamless way. Britain is basically starting that process now.
For those of you just tuning into Around the World in 30 Minutes on 88.7 FM or around the world at WRHU.org, we're here joined today by Ngaire Woods, founding dean of the Blavatnik School of Government and professor of global economic governance at the University of Oxford. Now, we're talking right now about the potential effects and how long it would take for Britain to really be ready to leave the EU, which our deal has been reached, so it's happening. What it sounds to me like you're saying, Ngaire, is that what this is really going to affect is the people, and especially business owners, people that are relying on trade. So as an economic professor, can you tell us how the economics of, day-to-day life for these people that are relying on trade with the EU, how is this going to affect them?
So, and I'm very much a political economist who looks at regulation and institutions. I'm not an economist's economist. How this affects, the people is it's pretty profound. As we've seen already, now that Britain has, for the last 8 days, been outside of the European Union, it means every truck that's taking goods or that's bringing medicines, for example, for COVID from the European Union to Britain now has to be treated just as all other third-party countries are treated. So that means you need paperwork. I mean, nobody wants to import goods which might be unsafe, which might have been unsafely created. You think you're buying medicine, but it's actually poisonous, for example. And that's why countries have very clear trade agreements and clear standards of equivalence across them, so that they can buy and sell things knowing that they'll be safe without having to check every single item. But all of this has to be negotiated and carefully checked. So we've already seen trucks arriving at the border and discovering that they don't have the right paperwork and being sent back to base. And that's very difficult for companies because they've got customers that need orders filled, they've got hospitals that need those drugs in stock. So right from the goods side of trade, you can see the effects. Longer term, the 4 years of uncertainty has meant that for businesses that need to know, are we going to build a factory in Britain or shall we build that factory in Germany or in the Netherlands? The 4 years of uncertainty simply creates havoc. You can't make business decisions if you think that in a year's time, there's going to be huge barriers to you selling what you're making to other countries that are nearby. So Brexit has happened, but a lot of the negotiations still need to be done. Let me just add, the British economy, like the American economy, is a large part of its GDP is services. That's design, insurance, the music industry, radio stations, doctors, dentists, all kinds of different services. Financial services, obviously, a huge part of it. To trade in services, you need these regulatory equivalence arrangements. It sounds really technical. It just means you need to trust that a doctor who's trained in someone else's country is going to be just as good as a doctor that's trained in your country before you start saying, we'll accept their services, we'll accept for them to come and treat our patients. There's a whole lot of negotiations that have not yet taken place. So equivalence in financial services, for example, that all hasn't taken place. So Britain now is no longer part of the European Union. But for British business, there's still a lot of detailed negotiation to take place before they know what position they're going to be in when it comes to selling their goods and services to the European Union. Equally, our police officers who need shared information. If you've got a criminal that skips off and jumps on a ferry and goes to Europe and somehow disappears, or somebody that's absconded illegally with children, child trafficking, you need to be able to share information very quickly about the whereabouts of those people. All of these details need negotiation. That's why it's a tricky process.
And you mentioned hospitals, which of course is a very big thing right now, given the COVID-19 pandemic. How has Brexit already changed and, will change in the future things like vaccine rollout and, economic recovery strategies compared to when Great Britain was part of the European Union?
So the great hope, and look, I've been putting to you all the costs of Brexit. Of course, there are advantages to Brexit. Although they take careful planning and good government to achieve. The European Union, has its own, for example, medicines regulator. In fact, that medicines regulator sat in London, and so it was greatly advantageous to Britain to be part of that system and to have them in London. But I guess what the Brexiteers and government would say is that being outside of the European Union has enabled them to move more quickly to get approval of the COVID vaccines and to start rolling them out across Britain. And similarly, they hope to be able to start using state aid, for example, to help British business compete with European business. In other words, to make use of a nimbleness outside of Brexit. But the reason I'm skeptical about that, Eli, the reason why I think these arguments have been overplayed is that almost everything the government wants to do freed from Brexit, it was perfectly free to do while it was part of the European Union. So I think it's a little bit of a red herring, the argument.
Right. And while we're on the topic of the coronavirus pandemic, how has COVID impacted the way that Britain spent this enormous period of structural change?
Yeah, really hard. I mean, this is not an easy time to be in government. We have a government that is both having to deal with COVID and having to deal with a sudden Brexit, which hasn't been fully negotiated, although that problem is of its own making. And it has stretched government right to breaking point. I mean, there are senior people in government who are simply saying, if it's not about Brexit or COVID, please don't bring it to me. But if you think about it, there's a whole lot of other things that governments need to do. Make sure that environmental maintenance of infrastructure is taking place. There's flooding in Britain that needs dealing with. There's all the normal health challenges in Britain. There's a social welfare system to keep going. There's, digitizing government itself, regulating technology. It's a lot that needs to be happening and dynamic in government. Government's difficult at the best of times. And now we've got this. What I would say is that one of the lessons that Britain has learned from the way it's managed COVID is that it needs much better to connect central government to local government, the government in each of the devolved parts of the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom has Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, and England, and they need to work more closely together. But so too, the government needs to work with cities, with mayors, with regional governments, because you can only beat COVID by connecting up the dots and ensuring that local governments, and the United States has learnt this at their cost, that you need one coherent, cooperative set of policies that ensures that resources are given to cities to fight at the local level, to set up test, trace, isolate, contain measures at the local level. And that the United States and Britain, who started this pandemic with such fantastic resources, both of them, they were ranked number 1 and 2 in the world for their pandemic preparedness in 2019. And yet they've performed as 2 of the worst performers through these first 3 phases of COVID. There are sobering lessons of governance there. And one of them is this need to link central government to local government across these countries. That's also going to be necessary as Britain adjusts to Brexit and to being outside the European Union.
For those of you just joining us on Around the World in 30 Minutes, I'm your host, Eli Finkelson, joined right now by Ngaire Woods, founding dean of the Blavatnik School of Government and professor of global economic governance at the University of Oxford. Now, Ngaire, I want to sort of shift focus into how Brexit is affecting relationships with other countries on not necessarily just an economic scale, but on other levels as well, and its effect on relationships around the world. So first and foremost, how have relationships altered across Europe with this new change in all different aspects?
Well, it's, this has come at a hard time for the European Union because the European Union faces a number of different challenges at the moment. There's the challenge of the countries like Hungary and Poland that don't want to play by the European rules politically and in human rights terms. There's a challenge of the countries that are bearing the brunt of floods of refugees coming from Syria, coming from Afghanistan, coming across the Mediterranean. So the southern European states, Italy, Greece, Spain, who are at the moment having to pick up all the costs of being the first point of entry into the European Union of these vast numbers of refugees. And that is creating a debate. There's the outfall of the 2008 financial crisis, which means that some of the northern countries see themselves as creditors and see the southern countries as profligate debtors. So there are already fault lines in the European Union, which it is trying to pull together and overcome. And then on top of that, Brexit, which pulls into question whether countries can be part of it and leave. And what that means is that there will be parties, political parties, campaigning in every European Union country to exit the European Union. That's already been happening. So the European Union needs to make sure that this doesn't look like a good strategy for any country, or it will come up against a fight in every electorate within the European Union on Brexit. But the consequences for Britain are pretty profound as well. Back in 2016, when British people voted to exit the European Union, what they thought they were looking at was a world where they had they called it the golden relationship with China, the rising power. They had a special relationship with the United States, which they treasure. And the world seemed like Britain's oyster. So the idea that Britain would cast itself off from the European Union to cement these new friendships with China, with the United States, with India, with the former Commonwealth countries and such like, looked like a positive opportunity. But in 2021, the world looks very different. The relationship with China has soured. 4 years of the United States under President Trump was a lesson in you can't blindly rely on certainty in a relationship with this particular president who has a, if you like, dynamic presidential style, changes the goalposts every week on allied countries. Suddenly, Brexit, instead of looking like Britain making the most of great relations around the world, looks a little bit like Britain alone in a world that is changing very quickly and where most countries are learning to stand together. So look at the way that China is shoring up relations with all the countries in its own neighborhood, at the way that the United States has, even under President Trump, done a new deal with Canada and Mexico, which cements those, hemispheric relations. I think there'll be a new reckoning in the European Union in a world where everybody else is cementing their regional relations about what the European Union means and how to make sure that European countries can rely on each other in a world that suddenly looks more fragmented and polarized.
It's interesting. I appreciate the term changing the goalposts. I haven't heard that one before. But speaking of President Trump and Britain's relations with the United States, President Trump and Prime Minister Boris Johnson have had this sort of on again, off again, sort of rocky relationship over the last few years. How will Brexit plus a change of United States leadership with the change to the Biden administration on the 20th, how will those two things in tandem affect Britain's relationship with the United States?
Look, the relationship between Britain and the United States is one of those of, great friendship and commonality, of language, of certain parts of culture, of intelligence sharing, which is a very important part of it. But I think there's always a risk that Britain overeggs how special it is in the special relationship with the United States. Every new incoming Secretary of State in the United States does the tour of Europe, trying to find new forms of words to describe the very special relationship with Germany, the very special relationship with the United Kingdom, the very special relationship with France. Obviously, it's not in the United States' interests to say that its relationship with Britain comes primus inter pares, although that's what Brits would, on the whole, like to believe. And there were always tensions. Look at the Suez Crisis, where the United States found itself reprimanding Britain and France for their attack, and the Iraq War, which again created real divisions both within Europe and between certain parts of the British government and the United States. So look, it's not a relationship without tension points. The Conservative government under Boris Johnson is looking forward, I think, to working with the new presidential administration in the United States, not least because it looks like it would be a more conventional one where there will be a more stable set of policy platforms. There'll be a more experienced and technocratic group of people handling each of the portfolios. One of the difficulties of the last 4 years for those of us that live in other parts of the world and dealing with the United States is that it's not been clear who you can call or who you can speak to or who actually is fully briefed on the issues that with which you need to speak with the government. It's been a roller coaster, but every American knows that already.
Now, I'm not sure if this is a foolish question or not, but is there a situation where Britain would rejoin the European Union? Is that even possible?
Absolutely. I mean, it won't be rejoining the European Union per se, but I mentioned Switzerland earlier because my expectation is that Britain will spend the next decade and a half negotiating individual agreements, very much as Switzerland has done. And it'll probably end up with over 100 agreements with the European Union that create the equivalence of membership of the European Union without being a member of the European Union.
And what sort of precedent do you think that it sets for other countries in the European Union or globally? Does it set a global precedent for independence?
I don't know. I think it's been very interesting watching other European reactions to it. After Britain's Brexit referendum, you saw the National Front in France, start pushing harder on Frexit. But actually, they quite quickly started attenuating that stance when they started actually realizing what it might mean for Britain and what it would mean for France. So I don't know. I think there'll be lots of politicians who use Brexit either to claim the advantages of independence or to claim the costs of independence. I think democratic governments have to listen to the people. But one of the lessons about Britain's Brexit referendum is how badly referendums serve to actually hear what people's anxieties and concerns actually are. That the 2016 referendum in Britain created what I would call a cry of pain from a lot of Britain who had really suffered from the global financial crisis. And in the surveys of those people, yes, they might feel better about British sovereignty by being out of the European Union or not, but nobody voted for a series of policies that would make Britain poorer and make the prospects of jobs in Britain less. Sadly, because of the way Brexit's been taken forward, I think Britain is in a more difficult position to create jobs and to create prosperity. It's going to take more catch-up time. I regret that because I don't think that was necessary. I think you could have negotiated a Brexit taking longer time with more respect for the firms who are trying to make this work, for workers who need to adapt to new jobs, and to partner governments in European Union countries who need to make this work in their own countries.
Is there anything else that you feel is important to add, either about what's going on in Britain right now, or about Brexit itself, or the global implications of it?
I think the big lessons for every country in the world are about international cooperation and how you sell that to your own population. That it's very, very easy in a slightly polarized world to say, look, America's got to be first, Britain's got to take back control. Because these slogans resonate, they make people feel better about where they are. And yet it's just politicians playing people, because there are so many ways in which cooperation with neighbors is what creates jobs and what leads to better produce, better lives. That's not to say it always does. That's not to say globalization is great. No, globalized opportunities for companies without globalizing their responsibilities. And that there is a rebalancing project there that needs to be done. But I think it's a great, it's hugely damaging to let politicians persuade people that every country can simply do its own thing. Because it's true that every country can do its own thing, but it's also true that when it does that, it hugely impoverishes a lot of its poorest people, that it hugely debilitates its police and security from having the information and backup that they need to do their jobs well. It hugely makes the medical system more fragile if it can't import the drugs it needs for patients, if it can't be part of cooperative research, which creates vaccinations, which save people from, which means that, it's been incredible watching within the European Union. When Italy ran out of ICU beds, Germany immediately offered ICU beds and started taking ambulances from Italy into German hospitals so that they could be treated. You can do this when you cooperate. You can't do it when politicians sell to people that they'll be better off when countries are completely on their own.
Thank you so much, Ngaire Woods, founding dean of the Blavatnik School of Government and professor of global economic governance at the University of Oxford. I thank you so much for your time and speaking with me today.
It's a pleasure, Eli, and good luck with your new president in the United States.
Thank you. And that will do it for this week's edition of Around the World in 30 Minutes. Special thank yous to producer Cassidy Slamman, reporter Connor Donnelly, and researchers Daniel Gall and Matt McDermott. I'm Eli Finkelson. Keep an eye out, America. There's more around the world than you might think.